Good afternoon. I'm Chuck Kasky, CEO of Maryland Realtors, and thank you all for joining us today. I'm looking forward to this session. We have two incredible people with us today. At first will be Lawrence Yun, Chief Economist for the National Association of REALTORS. And our second speaker today, a man who needs no introduction, but I'm going to introduce him anyway. Chairman and CEO of the Sage Policy Group, Anirban Basu, I'm sure well known to our viewers. So we're going to start, each presenter will have 15 to 20 minutes or so to show some slides and discuss the economic impact of the pandemic, and focusing obviously on real estate matters. And there'll be time for questions at the end of each presentation. And so, Lawrence, you're up first. So again, welcome to Maryland, virtual Maryland, if it will. And again, I just said this privately to both of you, but the fact that we have you and you've available and made time for us, we're incredibly grateful, and we appreciate the impact and the input both of you have had on business in general, but also in particular. So again, welcome both of you.
All right, good afternoon, Maryland Realtors, and glad to be here. These are quite a challenging times. You know, the unemployment filings that is keep rising. Today, another 3 million, you know, bringing the number up to 33 million people who have been laid off. So I'm going to download the PowerPoint to make the presentation easier to comprehend. So just bear with me just 1 second. All right, and then I will put in the, okay. So the way I see the economy, and without a doubt, we are in highly uncertain times. There could be many directions to the economy. You know, people discuss whether it is going to be a V-shaped recovery, means a sharp downward trend followed by a sharp upward trend, or a U-shape. You go down, stay down for a while, then recover, or even a W, especially with some states reopening the economy. I hope it can be done safely. But there's also some risk involved of the virus spreading a little faster, and hence whether or not we get a W shape. You go down, back up, go down again, and go back up. But the economy through the 2019 and January and February of this year was clearly moving in the right direction, quite solid. And for some Maryland Realtors who are in leadership, who attend the NAR mid-year meetings. Today we are virtual, but under normal circumstances, you will be with 8,000 other realtors from across the country in Washington. And last year, this time, we always invite the sitting president. So President Trump accepted our invitation. And if you recall, the President Trump, who can be highly divisive, and prone to exaggeration, but when he ran off the economic numbers, he was pretty much on the mark about the lowest unemployment rate across all demographic groups, the 10 years of economic expansion. So, you know, stock market at an all-time high. So everything was running quite well before we hit this pandemic. And 2020, without a doubt, will be a quite ugly. The first quarter numbers were in, which is negative, and I think this is the chart that I wanted to show you. That first quarter, the GDP contraction of 4.8%. By any historical measurement, 4.8% GDP decline would be considered quite severe. But this is nothing compared to the negative number one will witness in the second quarter, anticipated to be maybe minus 25%, minus 30%, or even now minus 40%, as some people are calling during the economic lockdown. But let's look at the first quarter, the 4.8% decline as to how it came about. Consumers contracted. Consumers just simply did not spend money. and also businesses did not spend money. The first quarter is reflecting January, February, and then March. So this is implying that January and February were fine, so March truly collapsed. And then April, May, still in economic lockdown, will have a quite a significant negative hit to the economy. Interestingly, the housing sector remained very positive up to the first quarter. Residential investment, whether home building, home sales, remodeling activity, was 21% higher. So it was running quite strong. Housing sector was very strong pre-pandemic. Personal income increased. So note that if income increased, but consumer spending fell, well, people are saving more money. So people are saving a lot of money. It could be partly due to the pessimism about the economic outlook. So they are retrenching, trying to have that rainy day fund just in case. Or it could simply be that, well, economy is on a lockdown. I cannot go to a restaurant. I cannot do this. I cannot go boating. Whatever it is, that economic lockdown prevents people from spending money. So they are saving dollars. But the first quarter, clearly negative. Second quarter will be far, far worse. Third quarter, fourth quarter will be positive. But the question is whether it's a V-shape, U-shape, or W-shape type of recovery. This was the job market pretty much pre-pandemic. It reflects March data. So the very last data point, you see some decline. But the April, May will be much sharper decline in terms of the overall jobs. But this is to just illustrate the fact that the economy had been moving along very nicely. The middle of the chart shows the Great Recession that we encountered roughly 10 years ago when the subprime mortgages blew up, foreclosure mess. We remember those times. You know, it was a real estate induced economic recession back then. But we recover, and then job creation reaching an all-time high. Throughout the state of Maryland, one can see that from the low point of 2009 to the latest pre-pandemic, about 300,000 jobs were added to the state. So again, things were moving nicely before the pandemic hit the economy. This is a national figure on the total number of people who are currently receiving unemployment checks. And by the way, NAR lobbied aggressively, and we got an approval for the unemployment insurance or pandemic unemployment insurance for independent contractors. From our perspective, we wanted to assure that members can tap into the resources. Part of the stimulus measure is, in essence, the government is acknowledging that it is a government-induced economic lockdown. People are working hard, and if people lose jobs because of the government-imposed lockdown, they should not be hurt financially. So the theory is to replace a good portion of the lost income, and hence the enhanced unemployment insurance check at the minimum of $600 per week. So each week, $600 minimum. Some people may be receiving $1,000 or more. And some analysis actually indicate that, say, someone who was working as a cashier at, say, Macy's department store now doesn't have a job, their unemployment compensation could actually be higher than the wage they were receiving working as a cashier. But the majority, the current replacement of income is not fully replacing the 100% of the income that is lost. So during this downturn, please tap into the resources that are available. So for realtors, again, the pandemic insurance relief of $600 per week minimum. And for brokerages, the small business loans, which do not have to be paid back if it meets certain criteria. So please tap into all these resources during this economic lockdown. So these are the total number of people receiving unemployment check. Look at the very last number. Blue is actually my estimate based on how it has been trending. And it is 25 million. 25 million people are receiving unemployment checks. But this is the headline figure that you see in the media. This is how many people are filing for the very first time. So in the latter part of March, you see a huge surge, including the first week of April. And the number of people filing for the very first time, at least it is diminishing. Just like the new cases of coronavirus, in order to flatten the curve, the number of new cases must flatten out first. So at least we are seeing some sense of flattening the curve condition. But if you add up all the number of new cases, it is 33 million people who have been laid off, 33 million. Let me go back to the prior chart. So again, the total number here is 33 million. But if I go to the prior chart, this shows 25 million. So what's the difference between 35 and 25? It shows that some people who got unemployed, maybe for 1 or 2 weeks, then they found a job. So they are no longer receiving the unemployment check, whether they found a job at Walmart, Costco, Amazon. In my calculation, roughly 1 million people are finding a job each week. But it is still not sufficient for the 3 million people who have lost a job in the most recent week. So we still have more people being laid off compared to people who are finding jobs. But the media, I think, is doing part disservice by just concentrating on the total of this, which is 33 million, versus and not excluding people who are finding job, which is averaging about 1 million a week, in my estimation. Maryland situation looks like this: the first-time filers. So it was flattening the curve. Then the today's data that came out shows an uptick, 80,000 Maryland residents filing for unemployment insurance. So we are not out of the woods by any means. So the number of people without job continuing to increase. But fortunately, the massive stimulus package is trying to replace lost income for people who have lost jobs. Let's look at the two localized disaster events. Nothing can compare to today's pandemic, but nonetheless, I think there is some illustrative points that we can learn from past localized disaster events. First is the New Orleans. You see the unemployment rate, which was running around 6% before suddenly popping up to 16% and dropping back down. So what was that New Orleans event about? It was a Hurricane Katrina. So Hurricane Katrina occurred and all the small businesses shut down, restaurant business shut down, and tourism industry shut down. In a sense, it's like today's job loss situation. But because of massive amount of money that went into the New Orleans disaster relief, unemployment rate did come down. Now, there were some people who permanently dislocated from New Orleans to Houston or Memphis, but overall employment situation quickly stabilized in New Orleans. People may say, well, flood is much different compared to the pandemic. Pandemic is about fear. Well, let's go to New York City. The large unemployment rate that you see in the middle is related to the subprime mortgage blowing up and the foreclosure. So that's not what I want you to focus on. I want you to focus on 2001, September 11th event. So the unemployment rate in New York City was running at 4%. September 11th, that horrific event hit, unemployment rate increased to 7%. And then it took several years to really bring it down. So the New York City event was more related to the fear. You are eating at a restaurant and you don't know who may be bringing a bomb to blow it up. So there was a pervasive fear in the New York City region. So it took longer to bring the unemployment rate down, but it eventually went back down and became very lively before the subprime lending blew up. But after the blow up, you can see that the most recent pre-pandemic unemployment rate in New York City was under 4%. So with every disaster, somehow New York City eventually recovered. And we cross our fingers that that would be the case in New York City after experiencing the worst of the coronavirus impact. People in a hospital, ventilator, we saw those TV images. So the prior chart, just to illustrate that even though the worst of the disaster, we get through it, especially if there is a large stimulus money coming into the region. Nationwide today, we have the largest ever stimulus measure, and there could even be stimulus number 4, infrastructure spending coming along. So there's quite a large number of dollars flowing into the economy. The housing sector was doing fine. the low point is after the foreclosure. So we are nowhere near the bubble years of 2005. So home sales has been rising due to the employment growth, job creation, not due to the funny mortgages. So we were in a good shape going into the pandemic. But if there was one complaint from realtors about the market condition before the pandemic was just not enough inventory of homes for sale, especially affordable price points. So on the luxury end, this inventory sat on the market for a long period, but anything that was mid-price or below, multiple bid was quite a common activity because of the inventory shortage. The first month of the pandemic impact is shown in the March pending contracts, which declined 21% nationwide. I think the April data will show more closer to 40% decline in April. We are in the first days of May. So, looking at the MLS, bright MLS data, it looks to show about 40% decline in the month of April, which means the closing activity, even up to May, will be quite down from 1 year before. So here is my forecast for the home sales. So the shaded area shows, that brownish color shaded area shows the actual numbers. 2018, 5.34 million home sales across the country. 2019, coincidentally, exactly the same. So no change in home sales, but realtors were quite content. They were saying those were respectable numbers. In the first quarter, the sales were up 5%. So people were anticipating that this was going to be a breakout year, much better condition, and then pandemic hit. So consequently, because of the pandemic, the second quarter, my forecast is to be down anywhere from 35% to 45%. So a large decline. In Pennsylvania and Michigan, it could be down about 70% or even 80%. Why? Because in Pennsylvania and Michigan, you cannot show homes. They're in a strict lockdown. Only transaction that can be done is 100% virtual, 100% electronic signature, not even doing social distancing. That is not permitted. In Maryland and Virginia, social distancing home sales can be done. So, mask on, keep the distance. Realtors, I'm sure, have opened all the doors so people don't have to touch the door handles. Lights are already on. So people can still view homes with social distancing. And in the first month of the pandemic, I would say there was a degree of shock, which is not surprising because first, people do not know how dangerous the virus is. But at some point, people are beginning to go to grocery stores. They need to eat. So as people are going to the grocery store with a mask on, gloves on, and then you compare the activity at the grocery store versus purchasing a home, and I think most realtors will say purchasing a home is quite a safer activity than going to the grocery store. So as long as people are following social distancing, I think home sales can be done in a safe manner, but the confidence is still important. If the buyers don't have confidence that it is a safe activity or buyers don't have confidence about the economy, they may not be returning. But as the economy steadily reopens, Governor Hogan has indicated that there will be certain phasing of the reopening of the economy, and then we may begin to see less of a decline. If there is any early indicators, one has to look at Georgia. People are criticizing the governor of Georgia to say he's opening up too early. It could lead to the second wave. So I hope he is making the right decision in a safe way. So just crossing the finger in terms of the health risk. But in terms of the economy, what's happening in Georgia is the following. The inventories are popping up. So as the governor is reopening the economy, inventories are suddenly showing in quite a significant way. And as the inventories are popping out, is getting the buyers excited. Now, some of you may be asking the question, okay, we have this high unemployment. So how in the world can buyers be excited about the inventory that's popping up? The answer is we had a pent-up housing demand. So we know that there was a demand before the pandemic. And even during the pandemic, I would characterize about 70% of those people with jobs would have secure employment. And hence, people with secure employment, what are they looking at? They are looking at record low mortgage rates. So given the record low mortgage rate combined with little more choices available, more transaction could soon follow. So Georgia right now is seeing a pop-up in inventory. They're indicating there are a lot of buyer interest activity. I have not yet seen the closing figures or the pending contracts as of yet, but we have to really see at least the economic impact. Again, health risk is a different part, so I hope Georgia is able to do it in a safe way. But the reopening of the economy has really brought the new listings onto the market. Another sort of positive indicator is the following, or at least to say that the worst may be over. This data is from the Mortgage Bankers Association showing how many people are filing for mortgage applications, not for refinances, but for home purchase. So before the pandemic, it was running about 10% higher compared to 1 year before, 10% higher. Then the pandemic hit, you see the decline. At the low point, 35% reduction in mortgage application compared to 1 year before. But now it is down only 20%. So perhaps the very worst case is already over. And I mean, mortgage application does not mean mortgage approval, but at least people are interested in trying it out. So this trend is implying that perhaps we will soon cross the 0% line, meaning same activity as 1 year ago in, say, several more weeks. Federal Reserve, in the meantime, is all in. This is the Fed funds rate. Sometimes the Fed lowers the rate, other times they raise the rate. One thing to note is that back in 2008, when the subprime lending economic recession was happening, it took the Federal Reserve almost 1 year to bring the interest rate down to 0. Today, they went all in, or I should say middle of March, they decided to go all in. Don't try to stretch it out in small increments over time. So Federal Reserve is all in terms of interest rates. Consequently, the mortgage rates, blue line, is at all-time low. The red line is the 10-year Treasury because mortgage rate generally follows the 10-year Treasury. If you look at the last data point, you see that 10-year Treasury is much lower compared to the mortgage rates. In other words, the gap is larger than normal. So one may say there is a possibility that mortgage rate may even go down more. I mean, we will accept 3.3% or 3.2% mortgage rate as being great, but it could even go down under 3% given the gap that has developed. Also, another point worth noting is jumbo market is not working. So for expensive properties, it is very difficult to obtain 20% down payment, pristine credit score to get jumbo mortgages because it doesn't have the backing of the Fannie and Freddie or the FHA government-backed situation. So only the government-backed mortgages are working. Now, some people say that we may not get mortgage rate under 3% because mortgage market is not perfect. First, the jumbo market is not working, but also the fact that we have the mortgage forbearance. Because of the mortgage forbearance, we don't have any panic selling at the moment. So people who have lost job, they can skip on mortgage payments for a few months until they find a job. It's not a free lunch, but whatever months of they did not pay the mortgage, it will simply be tacked on at the end of the life of the loan. So in other words, it's not a balloon payment. You know, you find a job and now you have to pay 3 months of mortgage all at once. That's not the case. And certainly talk to your mortgage servicer if they are requesting it, because that's not the case. What's happening is that 30-year fixed rate mortgage has now become 30 years and 6-month mortgage. So whatever missed payment is just simply being tacked on at the end of the life of the loan. If the person has to sell the home, then they don't have as much equity because they missed the mortgage payment, so they don't have as much equity than before. So at least for the interim, that there will not be any panic selling. And this mortgage forbearance lasts for 6 months. And then if people need another 6 months, they can obtain another 6 months. So a total of 12 months as of today. And it's possible that if Congress decides to extend that, they may do so. And they are able to do that because Fannie and Freddie is effectively owned by the government. I mentioned about the housing shortage. And the reason for housing shortage was home builders have been underproducing for multiple years. And I hope you cannot hear what I am hearing, which is a lawnmower outside. So every day, one of the neighbors is always mowing the lawn. But the home building activity has been under and was finally going above normal before the pandemic. But once the pandemic hit, it went down again, which means that if the buyers come back in some normalcy, again, 70% of the people with job have a secure employment, they're seeing a record low mortgage rates, we could face housing shortage again because builders have contracted during the pandemic period. And let me go almost towards the end. We took a survey of home buyers and home sellers about the price conditions. Sellers are easier to understand. So the sellers is on the right-hand side. 72% of the sellers are saying they are not reducing price compared to the price they thought was pre-pandemic. Maybe they knew there was a housing shortage. They knew that there was a multiple bidding. So home sellers are unwilling to lower the price compared to the pre-pandemic period. What about the buyers? Well, 37% of the buyers do not expect lower price. 16%, maybe 5% reduction in price, additional 20%, 10% reduction in price. So the buyers think there could be some discount, but that's always normal. You know, buyers never want to offer 100% of the list price, so there's always room for price negotiation. But at least this is implying that there is absolutely no panic among home sellers. And the data from Bright MLS is clearly indicating that we are not seeing any dent to the prices as of yet. It may come. I don't think it will come, but it's certainly possible, but not happening at the moment because no panic among home sellers. The massive stimulus package, so hopefully this can at least provide a necessary income replacement for those people impacted. Again, small business loans, enhanced unemployment insurance, meaning minimum of $600 per week, delay mortgage payments, foreclosure, eviction, there's a freeze on that, or at least for Fannie and Freddie back apartments, and the Federal Reserve all in using something called QE, quantitative easing. So what is quantitative easing? Well, let me back up a second. Where is the government getting the money for all these unemployment checks? Well, they're running up a large deficit. Who is buying this debt? Well, it could be Chinese government, that's possible, or it could be German mutual fund, or just some retirement fund on Wall Street, so that's possible. But way the government is currently financing their deficit is through printing of the money. It's the Federal Reserve who is purchasing this debt, so it's a lot of printing of the money. So if there's a lot of printing of the money, economic textbook would say there will be inflation. But America is very fortunate to have this extraordinary privilege of US dollar. Because of the US dollar, we don't have to have inflation this year, next year, or even the year after that because of the US dollar from printing of the money. But nonetheless, you have to say something is not right if we are constantly printing money. If we have stimulus number 4, more printing of the money, I mean, how much can we get free lunch? I mean, how much of it? So if people remember the 1970s, we did have inflation. Everything cost 10% higher one year, the next year, another 10%. So it's possible that we may have higher than normal inflation 5, 6, 7 years from now. Not in the immediate term, but in the future years, we may have higher inflation. What does that mean? Price of tomato would be more expensive. Rents would be rising. Home prices, very good inflation hedge, would be rising. But what will not be rising 5, 6, 7 years from now? Those people who purchase the home today or next year and locked in at 3% mortgage rate, their monthly payment is fixed for the life of the loan. So for realtors who want to make some convincing case for those potential buyers who have the financial resources, you may begin to say, well, with so much printing of the money, we may have inflation in future years, but one way to protect against that inflation is to have that fixed rate mortgage. Your monthly payment is completely fixed. It does not rise. And forecast is because of the disastrous second quarter, overall GDP, even with a positive growth in the second half, will be down. About 4 million total net job losses because there will be job creation in the second half. Prices, I think, will hold on. Sales will be down about 10 to 15%, but 2021 should be everything positive. Positive GDP, positive job gain, positive home price gain, and home sales recovering almost, rising 13 to 18%, pretty much replacing all the sales that was lost in 2020. So with that, best to you, stay safe. But as the economy slowly reopens, anticipate to be busier. So thank you.
Thank you, Lawrence. There are a couple of questions. If you have a little bit of time before you have to jump off, I would appreciate that. I hope I sound better. I was told my microphone was wigging out, so I got the trusty earbuds out. There are some questions about unemployment insurance, EIDL, those programs. We're not going to touch on that today. We are going to have another webinar with the next week with the Maryland Department of Labor, the unemployment person from Department of Labor. So we're going to save those questions for next week. But on the real estate market specifically, I guess piggybacking on the notion that the market is, and in Maryland, you're right, the Bright MLS stats seem pretty stable. I guess I'm questioning, however, given even the, again, historically low mortgage rates, which seems like we've been talking about that for a while, are buyers really going to be there? I mean, these are people that with the suffering and the job losses and the uncertainty, even with historically low rates, are the buyers going to be there when we come out on the other end of this?
People who have been impacted negatively on the jobs, they should not be in the housing market unless it is a temporary layoff where the rehiring just occurs just because it was a special circumstance. So if you look at the reopening of the economy, say the industry like restaurant, it will take several years to be fully back up. But even in the restaurant business, which was down 100%, are now down about 70% because people are doing takeout orders and maybe it will be down only 50%, but it's not going to be back up and fully running. Say dental offices, which was shut down, I think it will be up and running 100% soon as it's open. The daycare center, one can also look at the hair salon business. I think there's large pent-up demand where there will be quick job recovery. But 70% of the people still have, I would characterize as being secure employment. Maryland, there's many people working for the federal government. I would say that is in a very safe employment conditions. So people who have safe employment, they are looking at the low mortgage rates, and that's where the movement may occur. I mentioned about the September 11th event in the New York City area. The home sales actually increased the following year, and home prices were rising throughout that period, even though they were hit negatively in terms of economy. And the reasoning was mortgage rate fell because September 11th actually led to the recession. Federal Reserve cut interest rates. So we already had low interest rate, but still it's a downward movement from what was low to now the record low mortgage rates. So maybe that will provide some buffer for those with secure employment.
Yeah, that makes sense. What about lending standards? We're hearing that there's the underwriting standards are being increased, higher minimum credit scores and things like that. Is that going to be a headwind for buyers who want to take advantage of the low rate?
It's a headwind for non-conforming mortgages. So for jumbo mortgages, definitely, because it's not working. But the mortgages that Fannie and Freddie can purchase is still under normal circumstances, 5% down payment, or even in some cases 3% down payment, and meet the credit scores, and it can be sold off to Fannie and Freddie. Because from mortgage brokers' perspective, there's very little risk. They are just selling it over to Fannie and Freddie. but mortgage forbearance has brought some little stickiness issue, and that's where people are trying to work it out.
Yeah, we're trying to get the word out that mortgage forbearance does not mean mortgage forgiveness. And so we're having a lot of people are confused by that, and we'll have a different session on that. But and we have a lot of information about that. Are there specific metrics that you and then this is for Anirban later on to just keep in mind? I'm an amateur, obviously, but I really do find this stuff fascinating, and I try to read as much as I can. What would you be looking at that a layman can look at, like Fannie Mae's home purchase sentiment index or things like that? Do you have any ideas or advice for us in the industry trying to keep up on the trends? Any metrics that you can offer for the lay people? We love listening to you guys, we really do. But between seeing and listening to you guys, what kind of things can we be looking at?
At least in the current situation, the data that I'm monitoring most closely is days on the market. And the reasoning for that is, are we going to see 30% price decline as happened 10 years ago in the foreclosure mess? It's a completely different situation. We don't have oversupply, we don't have subprime lending, but the days on the market is very interesting indicator to see if we have a listing and then days on the market is very quick, it means what is hindering sales is lack of listing. So I'm monitoring that very closely, and so far the days on the listing is very comparable today versus 1 year ago. So that has really not changed, meaning that if you bring the listing, there is buyer ready to pick it up. Definitely in the mid price and below. Upper end is slow, but that's one indicator that I'm monitoring very closely.
Okay, that was a follow-up question too. Is there a segmentation we should be looking at? Will the recovery when it comes be more robust within certain price points, for example? Luxury market might be slower to recover, something like that?
The luxury market, the stock market hit, I thought would be a hindrance to the luxury market. But what do you know? Stock market has recovered quite strongly.
Yeah.
In fact, I think the NASDAQ is now today higher than what it was 1 year ago, which just simply does not make sense given the second quarter contraction in the GDP. But somehow the Wall Street believe that future apparently will come back lively. But the upper end market was soft pre-pandemic. I thought it will remain even softer because of the stock market hit, but the stock market has come back reasonably well. It's still down overall in terms of S&P and Dow, but the NASDAQ, I'm quite surprised.
Great. Lawrence, thank you very much for your time. We appreciate you stopping by. If you have to run, we understand. If not, or otherwise, we'll turn it over to Anirban. Again, welcome and thanks for joining us.
Righto, thank you, Chuck. Good to see everyone out there. I'm going to share my screen now and my presentation. So thanks a lot. I'll try to go through my material reasonably quickly in the interest of trying to get to Q&A. I really want to try to make this as relevant to folks as possible in the Maryland Realty community. Thanks again to Maryland Realtors for the invitation. So I just want to point out that we're less than 2 months into the crisis. And we really, the crisis from an American perspective won't turn 2 months until 2 days from now. And why do I say that? Well, you say, Anirban, that's absolutely incorrect. This is called COVID-19. And you know why it's called COVID-19? Because it's discovered in 2019. So it's more than 2 months. No, it's 2 months from an American perspective, because it wasn't until March 9th that the Dow Jones and the broader stock market actually noticed that there was a pandemic. Until that point, it was a Monday, as it turns out, March 9th. Until that moment, the stock market actually held up pretty well. And there were actually a lot of economists who were suggesting that we might actually be able to get through this crisis, this pandemic, without a recession. But on March 9th, the Dow Jones falls more than 2,000 points. At that time, that was an all-time high in terms of point loss on a single day for the Dow. Then we set another record on March 12th, and then another record on March 16th. It was a bad week. It wasn't until March 11th that the Utah Jazz are ushered away from the basketball court when it was discovered that their all-star center, Rudy Gobert, was affected or impacted or infected with coronavirus. A couple of days later, his teammate, Donovan Mitchell, was also discovered to have COVID-19. the Utah Jazz are a very good team, but that's it. It feels like it's been forever, but it's been less than 2 months. And so guess what happens because of that? We don't have much data on the nature of the magnitude of the downturn. So Dr. Yoon shared much of it, including those initial weekly unemployment claims and continuing claims, so on and so forth. We'll get more data, as it turns out, tomorrow, the Friday jobs report. But I want to point toward the recovery to come. There's been this big debate about whether or not the recovery would be U-shaped, L-shaped, check mark, Nike swoosh, square root, V, W, whatever. We're going to talk about that. There's some things that make COVID-19 different economically. There's a reason that this economy melted apart in a few days from extraordinary growth and momentum in January and February when we added all those jobs and enjoyed that 50-year low in unemployment at 3.5%, to being in very deep recessionary conditions, such that during the last 3 weeks of March, that was so bad that it pulled overall US GDP down 4.8% on an annualized basis. So those 3 weeks dominated the quarter. The first 9 weeks or so of the quarter were actually quite decent. And so, first of all, this is supply shock. So a lot of people have been trying to make comparisons between this and other periods. In fact, we saw some of that. Comparisons to 9/11, comparisons to Katrina. Others have tried to compare this to the Great Recession. Some have tried to compare this from a stock market's perspective to October 1987. No, it defies comparison, because a lot of those other things, 9/11 is an exception. That was another supply shock. But this is supply shock. This is not the demand shock of 2008, 2009, when credit simply dried up in the face of growing defaults and delinquencies on mortgages, the subprime mortgage crisis, so on and so forth. This is supply shock. What does that mean? Quarantines, travel bans and restrictions, closure of public places. And so in some sense, it did not matter what the pre-existing momentum was in the economy. This could have happened in the summer of 2009. It still would have been devastating to the economy. Now, since we had had more than 10 years of economic expansion, there was much further to fall. We had more people working, so more people were eligible to lose their jobs, so on and so forth. But my goodness, a lot of people have been looking at how the federal government and the Federal Reserve have been responding to the crisis. But obviously, that's not where the cure comes from. I mean, it helps. The payment side of the economy, when people get a $1,200 check, that helps. So you might remember that in early April, a lot of people were not current on their rent. They'd missed their rent payment. But by later in the month, some people were actually stroking rent checks. Why? Because they got some stimulus monies, and that helped. They got some unemployment insurance monies. That helped. But this supply shock is associated with factory closures, supply chain disruptions, cutback in service provisions. Basically, we flipped the economy off. I said that incorrectly. We turned the economy off. And maybe I was right the first time, as it turns out. But set that aside, the point is, we were on and then we're off. And so the cure doesn't come from the Federal Reserve or federal government, as it turns out. The cure comes from Regeneron, Gilead Sciences, Bayer AG, Pfizer, Merck, Sanofi Aventis. Some genius in the life science community, or some set of geniuses, will figure this out. And we'll have a therapy and ultimately a vaccine, one hopes. And so that's going to really affect the timing of this expansion. Now, as it turns out, when 33.5 million Americans filed for unemployment insurance during a recent 7-week period, and as Dr. Yoon pointed out, we got some more data on that today, those initial unemployment claims, that in itself, that triggers then a follow-on demand shock, the loss of confidence, loss of income, so on and so forth. And the Federal Reserve's lowering of interest rates and addition of liquidity to financial systems, the federal government stroking of checks, that helps that demand side issue. But ultimately, we need to get back to work at some point, right? When we feel that it's safe to do so, and we're not going to overwhelm medical systems or healthcare systems when we do that. So as I say, this pandemic did not respect the pre-existing momentum of the economy. It did not matter. The irresistible force, which seemingly was the economy, met an immovable object, and the immovable object, COVID-19, won. Now, coming into this period, despite that rapid economic growth, there was some fragility. Certain industries did not perform so well coming into the crisis. I'll give you an example: manufacturing, which spent 5 months late last year in recession, trade wars, the issues at Boeing, so on and so forth, the strong US dollar, all frustrating US industrial production. Agriculture, another sector of the economy that had been weak. But the global economy, as strong as the US economy had been coming in 2020, the global economy was fragile. I'll point out the second bullet here. Already, trade wars had pushed global growth in 2019, meaning last year, to its lowest rate since the 0.7% contraction in 2009. Now, we signed a first phase trade deal with China late last year. We ratified the USMCA, the US-Mexico-Canada trade agreement. We saw the resounding victory of Boris Johnson, the United Kingdom, and so there was more certainty regarding Brexit. So when was the last time, Chuck, or anybody else talked about Brexit? You may have been talking about Boris Johnson recently, but not Brexit. And so that was quite liberating for the global supply chain. There was less uncertainty surrounding the global supply chain. And that was one of the reasons that the International Monetary Fund projected or forecasted 3.3% growth for the global economy in 2020, much better than last year's 2.9% performance. The current projection from the International Monetary Fund is that the global economy will shrink 3%. And obviously, we live in a global environment, and so anything that suppresses global economic activity will ultimately suppress our recovery. More on that in a moment. We economists in general have been slow to come to the realization of how horrible this is. And part of that's because we've been trying wrongfully to compare this to other episodes. The commercial real estate downturn-induced recession of 1990-1991, the dot-com bust-induced recession of 2001, so on and so forth. Device comparison, it's its own thing. So now that economists have realized this, and Dr. Yun made mention of this, many forecasters are predicting that roughly 30 to 40% decline in GDP for the second quarter on an annualized basis. If you do the math on that, that means that GDP, practically speaking, would be 10% below its first quarter level, not 40%. That's an annualized figure. But nonetheless, you can see the forecast here from JP Morgan Chase and Morgan Stanley and others. By comparison, during the worst quarter of the Great Recession in late 2008, the economy shrank 8.4%. So you look at that and say, okay, the economy is shrinking much faster than it was in late 2008. And late 2008 was an awful period for the housing market. So this means that the housing market's performance will be even worse this time around. Well, we'll get to that in a moment. As it turns out, that's not true. And again, I want to get to ultimately not how painful this period is, but the nature of the expansion. But before I do that, I want to point out some things. Unemployment is set to go higher. And we're going to get a number on unemployment tomorrow, and we'll see what it says for April. But my very strong feeling is that unemployment right now in America is in the range of 20%, and that ultimately we'll hit that 25% figure that so many economists have been talking about. If you look at this table, this comes from a study conducted by the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. If you look at this, if you look at employed in occupations at low risk of layoff, that's about 54% of folks. And a lot of us, who can work remotely, and the Maryland realtor can work remotely to a large extent, relatively low risk of layoff. But there are many people employed in occupations at high risk of layoff, including folks in food preparation, for instance, the folks who work in restaurants, folks who work for retailers. And boy, oh boy, is retail in trouble in this country. Saw a few days ago the bankruptcy announcement by J. Crew. Today it was Neiman Marcus. Oddly enough, we're going to see even more once the economy opens back up, because one of the things that a retailer needs to do when they declare bankruptcy is liquidate their inventory, in part to generate liquidity to finance the lawyers and so on and so forth, that those costs that come with bankruptcy. So oddly enough, you're going to see even faster bankruptcy declarations by retailers after this economy opens back up. But 46% of folks are employed in occupations at high risk of layoff. So when you think about that, this notion that a quarter of the American population at some point, or the workforce, I should say, will be unemployed is hardly far-fetched. I won't go through this in great detail. Dr. Yun covered this, but this is initial unemployment claims, or initial claims for unemployment. We got the number this morning, 3.2 million. 33.5 million over the last 7 weeks. But as Dr. Yun pointed out, it is conceivable that somebody could be filing for unemployment today and get a job tomorrow. So what really matters probably is not this, though this gets the headline, it's continuing claims. We're talking about 22.6 million people receiving unemployment insurance as of April 25th. Well, that was actually quite a few days ago. So what is this figure like now? 25 million, something like that, probably. That's where we're at. And I think it would be naive to think that the housing market would not be affected by such unemployment dynamics. But again, keep in mind, who was most vulnerable to the downturn? It was many folks who probably are not in the market for a home. How does one say this in a sensitive manner? There are socioeconomic disparities. And there are people who have incomes that allow them to think about home ownership and people with incomes who don't. And as it turns out, and this is rather unfortunate, a lot of the vulnerable people in our society economically are people who, by and large, are renters. They work for retailers. They work for restaurants. Yes, of course, there have been restaurant owners that have been affected and so on and so forth. But a lot of the damage, I think, is actually going to be done to the rental market. It'll take the form of people not making rental payments. It'll take the form of them moving out before their lease is over, maybe moving back home. That doesn't mean that the owner-occupied part of the housing market won't be affected, but I think many realtors out there will be able to tell stories about, well, a house came up for sale in Severna Park, and we got multiple bids that day. And if you think about, housing in Maryland, think about it this way. A lot of people's circumstances have changed, and that actually results in more transactional volume, if you think about it. So a lot of people out there might be saying, look, I've been thinking about selling this house. I have a lot of equity in this house. Home prices are holding up. I don't know if that's going to continue, but home prices are holding up. This is the time for me to downsize. That puts more inventory on the market. Other people are saying, you know what? I've been living in downtown Baltimore in this apartment. It's been very difficult for me to social distance. I need to buy a home in Carroll County. I need to be in Harford County. I need to be in Anne Arundel County. I need to be in Baltimore County. Folks from New York are saying, boy, oh boy, we were the epicenter for this thing. And when it was time for me to leave New York, I didn't have another home to leave to. And I didn't want to get on an airplane to go to Florida. Maybe I should move to Maryland's Eastern Shore, or at least have a property there. So I can drive down 3 hours to Maryland's Eastern Shore, and I can shelter in place there more easily. And without getting on an airplane. If I were a realtor, that's the kind of story I'd be telling. And so, and then not to mention low mortgage rates and so on and so forth, and not to mention demographics. Because the most common age in America this year is 28. The second most common age in America is 29. Third most common age in America is 27. So you got a lot of millennials out there who are thinking about, or already were thinking about, maybe I need to go from apartment leasing. And many of these people, by the way, they've been living in newly constructed apartments, paying enormous amounts of rent. They'd actually save money from month to month to month buying a home in many instances. Now, don't get me wrong. A lot of those millennials have been affected economically as well. So there's an effect here. There's no question that supply shock that has impacted the economy results in a demand shock. But a lot of people are looking to change their circumstances at this point. And that means a lot of people are going to transact. And actually, the settlement table is going to be actually quite an active place. Another aspect of this is that I think that the recovery from this is actually going to be quite rapid. Now, there's probably too much data on this by half. Let me walk through this a little bit. This analysis comes from Oxford Economics. It's their global outlook. So a lot of lines on here. Okay. So the reason I use this is because I have deep and abiding respect for Oxford Economics as a forecasting group. I think they do a great job. So a lot of lines on here. Let me walk through this a little bit, okay? So 3 lines that are forecast lines. You see the blue line there? The blue line at the top there, that's the January baseline. That's what Oxford Economics was forecasting for global economic growth pre-pandemic. You see the yellow line there in between, the sandwich line? That's the current baseline. That's what Oxford Economics forecasts for global economic activity, given what is known. And then the red line at the very bottom, what's that about? That's, we're wrong. The economy does not come back to life in the third quarter. Through the third quarter, we have major economy shut down, and that's the pandemic downturn line. So, okay. So what they're saying is, in the yellow line, and that if you look at the yellow line, that under the baseline scenario, which is that yellow line, global GDP will decline by 7% during the first half of the year. That's what they're saying. In the red line, they're saying, no, this thing lasts not 2 quarters, but 3 quarters. Global GDP during those 3 quarters will fall 13%. Okay. But then there's a bounce back. And if you look at the yellow line and if you look at the red line, what do you see there? If you look very carefully, ladies and gentlemen, you see the letter V, V for victory. So this debate about whether or not it's L-shaped or U-shaped, the folks at Oxford Economics have come to the conclusion that it's V-shaped, as well as I have come to that conclusion. That doesn't mean it's going to be V-shaped just because some economists say it's going to be V-shaped, because you can also find economists that think it's going to be L-shaped, square root, check mark, Nike swoosh. But it has been a V when we've previously had pandemics. And while it might be useful to compare the current circumstance to Katrina or the flooding in Houston several years ago or 9/11 or whatever, how about we compare it to previous pandemics? Now, one of the ways in which COVID-19 is different, this pandemic is different, is it will be worse. It's deeper, more impactful. It shut down the global economy, not just parts of Africa, a la Ebola, not just parts of the Middle East, a la MERS, so on and so forth. Now, this analysis comes from Goldman Sachs. Too many lines on here by half, I get that. But if you can fixate on that light blue colored line that goes way up to the top and then back down, that pertains to Hong Kong's economy in 2003 during its SARS epidemic. So you see that skinny 0% line, the black line there that goes across? That is the average rate of pre-existing growth. That's where growth was prior to the pandemic or the epidemic. Now, obviously, early during the crisis, what happens? Growth falls below that pre-existing average, obviously. And if you follow that blue colored line there, that light blue colored line, that SARS Hong Kong 2003 line, and then growth gets worse as the pandemic begins to infiltrate more of the economy. But then what do you see after that? You see a sharp bounce back in economic activity. In other words, you look at this chart, you see a lot of V's. It's going to be a V. We turn the economy off, we're going to turn it back on. Oh, I get it. It's going to take weeks, right? This is a staged reopening. So it's over the course of weeks that various parts of the economy come back. But if you measure the bounce back in the form of months or quarters, it's a V. It's a V. The recovery is not going to take place in one day, but it's a V-shaped recovery if you look at it from the perspective of months and quarters. That's what it's going to be. We turn the economy off, we're going to turn it back on again, and the recovery from this is going to be quite sharp. One of the other reasons I think it's going to be a V is this. There's so much stimulus in the pipeline. We've had 4 rounds of stimulus thus far, and there'll probably another 1 or 2, including perhaps an infrastructure-oriented stimulus package. My hope is that soon there will be some relief for state and local governments because they have huge holes in their budgets. And there's this big thing going on in Washington, D.C. about we don't want to rescue New Jersey from all the previous mistakes it's made, not to pick on New Jersey or Illinois or whatever it happens to be. But we know, we can see what tax collection was in terms of income taxes, retail sales taxes, casino taxes, hotel taxes. We can see what it was before the crisis. And I think Congress probably should restore those lost monies to state government. So you're not solving the problem of Illinois' pension funds, if that's what you're trying to avoid, but you are helping Illinois or New Jersey or Maryland recover revenues that were lost. And the key point is this. The federal government doesn't have to balance its budget every year. Well, we know that's true. But state and local governments do. So there's a constraint there. And we don't want the public sector's deterioration, the loss of jobs for teachers, firefighters, and police officers, to reinforce the weakness that we see in the private sector. But coming out of this crisis, what else will we see? Low interest rates, low gasoline prices. It's going to be weird commuting back to work, isn't it? And seeing traffic. I know that we've gone out, and actually one of the pleasant things about this, you put on your mask, you go into your car, and there's no traffic, and it's lovely, isn't it? You get mad when there's a red light, but otherwise it's pretty, feels pretty good. But when people get back out on the roads, they're going to see low gasoline prices, which all things being equal is going to extend their spending power as they get back on the job and start receiving checks, not from the government, unless they work for the government, but from their private sector employer. So lots of reasons think this is going to be a V-shaped recovery. So that takes me to my final slide, and then we can go to Q&A. Look, this is the one forecast that my presentation theme this year is the Lord of the Rings, and so that's why you see this. But the recession has already begun globally in the United States, obviously, but I still expect this recession to be short and vicious, which is how my wife characterizes me. And that's because we're going to come back to the fall. Now, okay, there's this medical question out there about whether or not this is going to recur in the fall. And whether we're going to shut things down again. Maybe, I don't think so. because I believe I have some faith here, frankly. It's faith, it's not economics. That the geniuses at Regeneron, Gilead Sciences, Bayer AG, Pfizer, Merck, Sanofi Aventis are going to figure this out so that we don't have to shut this thing down again. That the medical toolkit is going to be much better by the fall. Look, the best position people work in the public sector, greater job stability, but the private sector workforce will be hammered. Unemployment will soon be greater than 20%. We'll get a number on that tomorrow. Our collective expectations as economists are still adjusting to the downside. We're still coming to terms with this. And I think one of the surprising things about this is how well the stock market has held up. As I'm speaking to you now, Maryland Realtors, the market's up 211 points. Again, we're going to get this devastating jobs report tomorrow. New York markets declare bankruptcy, but what do you know? So that's. I hope that continues, though clearly it might not, because there does seem to be a discontinuity between the economy's performance and what's been going on with the stock market. The market at 23,875.89 as we speak. And look, if we talk about the broader economy, let me tell you this: it's going to be awful during the second quarter. The second quarter will be the worst quarter of economic lives. But when it commences, make no mistake, the recovery from this crisis will be sharp, profound, and most welcome. People will be walking into a situation in which interest rates are low. There's lots of pent-up demand. There'll be a need to rebuild inventories as General Motors, Ford, Chrysler, BMW, others have shuttered their plants. And people are anxious to meet again, go to restaurants, see a movie not in their homes and not just on Netflix, but actually see a movie with popcorn and yes, Twizzlers. And to watch the Baltimore Orioles, which is the most beautiful thing a human being can do short of nurturing a child, and engage in other most wonderful of economic activities. And so that's it. Thank you very much, Chuck. I'm done. I hope we have some time for questions.
Thank you. I think we do. We have some in the chat room. I'm really disappointed, I have to tell you, that I was so looking forward to asking you about the K-shaped recovery, but you don't want to talk about the shape of the recovery. So I'll leave that for another day. I was also, you kind of touched on this, but for my own edification, economic crises are, I guess, intrinsically Darwinian, right? So there are going to be winners and losers. Who are the winners and the losers in your estimation?
Yeah. You know, what happens often with instances like this, Chuck, and it's very sad, the rich get richer, the big get bigger. Because it's a V-shaped recovery, but not for everyone. And I don't want people to misinterpret what I'm saying when I say a V-shaped recovery. I don't mean complete recovery. Complete recovery will take years. I'll give you a quiz question, Chuck. How long did it take America to get to a 50-year low in unemployment? Aha, precisely 50 years. That's a long time. So it might take us a long time to get back to where we were. But what I mean is the initial stage of recovery is going to be, really quite profound and wonderful to watch statistically. But yeah, there's going to be winners and losers. So a lot of restaurants are going to fail here. A lot of retailers are going to fail. You're going to see a lot of empty storefronts. Commercial real estate will be one of the last segments of this economy to fully recover. That would be my prediction. And so who gets bigger? Walmart, Amazon, Chewy, which sells pet stuff online, DoorDash, Grubhub. These are some of the winners. Main Street businesses may be the losers here. A lot of them are not coming back. And one of the things I'm looking for, you asked this question of Lawrence Yun, what are you looking for? I'm looking for what fraction of enterprises, business establishments come back to life after this is over. And how many leave, the universe in terms of their existence? I mean, how many businesses falter, whether restaurants, retailers, or others? And so, so some segments are going to come back. The e-commerce economy got a big push forward. Data centers, you're going to see a lot of construction of new data centers because the appetite for data, if it comports neatly with the appetite to engage in e-commerce activities. Also, there'll be a lot of data created by public health systems to try to, create a structure in which we can monitor these things more carefully and spot emerging pandemics more quickly. There will be some other winners. Alternative energy, for various reasons we can get into, ultimately I think will be a winner, because one of the things I expect is at some point, I know oil prices have been very low recently, at some point I expect oil prices to spike higher, because these low prices of today are causing drilling to shut down, a lot of energy suppliers to go bankrupt, so on and so forth, a lot of disinvestment in the energy sector, energy infrastructure. At some point, demand is going to pick back up globally and supply won't be there, and you're going to see a real price spike. And when that happens, alternative energy will be there to capture some more market share. So those are some of the answers to that question.
There was a lot of, in the chat, a lot of questions about rental, the moratorium currently, foreclosure and eviction moratoriums in place, both in the governor's executive order, more importantly, the chief judge of the Court of Appeals closing the courthouses until at least June 5th, if not longer. I want to get your opinion. I had a conversation with a small business owner, a friend of mine, who has a relationship with an attorney, and she's struggling. She did get a PPP loan, and she actually had the money to pay her rent, and asked her attorney friend for some advice, and the attorney said, "Don't. They can't do anything about that, so don't pay your rent, even though you could. Don't, because there's nothing the landlord can do to you at this point. Save it, and then on June 6th, pay all your back rent when the courts reopen." That concerned me on many levels. Ethically, number one, but there are several questions here. That's the reason I'm bringing it, and I had a personal experience with it. Do you expect a spike in foreclosures and evictions and what impact is that having, the lack of rental income on landlords and banks, of course, but were there going to be long-term shocks to that?
Oh, there's most definitely. So there's issue right now is forbearance, right? One of the most important words in the English language right now is forbearance. And some of this is government mandated forbearance. I mean, some of this is business forbearance. So I know if I'm a landlord, I know a lot of people are under pressure. I know that a lot of people have lost jobs. I know also that leasing activity may not be what it was going forward. It's going to be harder for me to fill apartments, in other words, which means that I need to work harder to keep my current tenants. And that induces me to engage in a bit of forgiveness. Because forget about this month, I'll get you next month. Those kinds of things, even absent a government mandate. But yeah, ultimately, I would say that a lot of these real estate investment trusts, as an example, that own apartment buildings and office buildings, so on and so forth, they're on the hook for what? Generating return. How do they generate return for their investors? They collect rent. And at some point, they can't forbear anymore. And they've got to do the capitalist thing, which is to say, you're not paying rent or you're not catching up on your rent. I'm sorry, you'll have to live elsewhere. And that's the way it's going to be. And so, yeah, you're going to see a lot of that. And it'll be very interesting to see which landlords fare better over time. Is it the landlord that is compassionate and says, look, forget about those months. Just pay me going forward. You missed 2 months, don't even worry about it. I'm not going to kick you out. Or is it the landlord that says, you missed 2 months, you got to pay me back now. I'll give you 2 more months to pay me back, but you got to do it now. Otherwise, you're out of here. Who fares better in the capitalist market structure? It'll be an experiment, a great experiment. My guess is the people who will fare the best are the compassionate landlords, but we shall see.
There's a question here. I'm not sure. It's perfect for you, I think. And it says, where should we focus our efforts to have the greatest impact on the economic recovery? That's a very broad question, but I love it.
It's a great question, and the answer is infrastructure.
Okay.
So I said it's going to be a V-shaped recovery. The initial phase of expansion will be quite sharp, though complete recovery will prove elusive for years. But it could be a W. So at some point, what's going to happen? The economy is going to be turned back on. We have all the stimulus in the pipeline. And then all of a sudden, that stimulus, ends up, that stimulus comes to a close, and people are still left with shattered confidence, and people are still left with wanting not to take on additional debt because they're nervous, they're scared, and so state and local government budgets will still be problematic, and so on and so forth. And so all of a sudden, it's like Wile E. Coyote, comes off that cliff and has lots of momentum coming off that cliff, but all of a sudden there's nothing below them to support him in that case, nothing to support him, and he falls. And that could happen to the economy too. And so at that moment, what will we likely need? And so now I'm talking about late 2021 or 2022, the economy loses some steam. We have a potential of a double-dip recession. We need a stimulus package, an infrastructure-oriented stimulus package, where we deal with some of our infrastructure issues. A lot of this money could just be pumped to state and local governments. In fact, I wish the government had already done it now. I wish we had a $500 billion package for state and local governments to A, close budget holes, and B, some of that money, at least 25% for infrastructure, whether it's the Howard Street Tunnel or whatever projects you can think of around the Baltimore area or throughout Maryland. And that would really go a long way to giving this expansion legs. So I think the answer is we address our awful rail system, we address our leaky electrical grid, our bridges that are beyond their useful life, and all those kinds of things. I mean, these are some serious public safety issues. Our water systems, our wastewater systems, our wastewater treatment plant, all of this stuff, our septic systems. We've got a lot of infrastructure issues here. I think that's the answer.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by the notion, the prospect of a rail link to HQ2 from Baltimore. That would be a game changer in my mind.
A really rapid rail link from Baltimore to Washington. I mean, we have the MARC train, and that can be useful as it turns out. I take the MARC train all the time. It's very useful not to have to park in Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
But and it connects us to Washington, D.C., but not in a world-class fashion.
Right.
Not in a way that the folks in Shanghai or Berlin enjoy, or Paris.
Yeah.
And so that's what we need. And so, yes, that's the kind of investment we should be making. High-speed rail would be a really good investment, especially for this region where we've got two metropolitan areas sitting right next to each other.
One last question, more macro or global, I guess. This whole virtual thing that we have very rapidly adapted to, what are the long-term implications of that? And maybe even on commercial real estate, for example, do you think there's going to be a retrenching and a reevaluation of our space needs if this actually becomes a way of life for us? Do you see that in more global sense sticking, I guess, or are we just going to go back? Because when I go to Annapolis, you hit the nail right on the head. I've been going to the office a couple days a week. I love it. It's amazing how quickly I can actually get to Annapolis from Baltimore if I have to right now. I don't want to go back to that, hour and a half. It's a 45-minute ride that takes me an hour and a half. And I'm just not looking forward to getting back to it. But is it going to stick, or are we just going to, how many times have we had things that we thought were going to have an impact on us for a really long time, and it goes away and we didn't learn anything, that whatever changes or whatever adaptations we had, we just kind of left behind and got back to the old normal. People keep talking about new normal, and I'm not using the word unprecedented because I've eliminated that word. I hate that word now, so I don't use it. But this new normal, is it really, or I know you think about this stuff. That's why I wanted to ask you this question. Is it going to stick, or are we just going to go back? Are we really ready to adapt to this more flexible kind of work environment, which then means we need less space and could have a negative impact on commercial real estate, for example?
Yeah, and I think Annapolis is the most beautiful place in the world when the legislature is not in session.
Yeah, right.
But I think that this is probably advanced. This episode is advanced remote work or telecommuting by a decade or something like that. I think people are going to be rethinking their spatial needs, but for a multiplicity of reasons, multiple reasons. One is, of course, we've discovered that we can work remotely, and we can actually be productive working remotely, not as productive as we are at work. Because let's face it, when you've got kids running around the house, it's just harder to do the work, right? There's a reason we have daycare centers, right? But that's one. But the other factor is that one of the reasons that a lot of firms were moving from Class B space to Class A or Class A plus space and paying more in rent doing that is recruitment. So we had the situation in which we actually had more job openings in America than we had unemployed people. So the challenge was recruiting workers, particularly that young knowledge worker. And one of the ways to do that is you bring them into the office, and the office is beautiful. It's Class A plus space. It's a beautiful location. They say, well, this is Success Address. I want to be here. But now with more workers available, including people graduating from college. I mean, these kids graduating from college this year, what a terrible situation for them, right? Not only do they miss their graduation and all those parties at the end of the year, but they graduate into the worst economy since 2008, at least, and maybe it's worse than that. So they're looking for work, and a lot of businesses are looking to cut costs. And all of a sudden, I don't need Class A plus space. I'm going to go to Class B, and I'm going to have less square footage per person because I know people can work remotely. And so they're not going to even be, forget about offices, even the cubicles, I'm going to have fewer of them because I don't need as many. So yeah, I think and that's one of the reasons, many reasons I think commercial real estate will be one of the last segments to recover, including office space markets. So this is going to have a real impact on new office space construction going forward, which is too big because I love new office buildings. They're beautiful additions to the skyline. You just won't see as many of them going forward.
Yeah, Okay, I think that's important. That'll be an interesting indicator to keep an eye on. We went a little bit over time, but it was fascinating. I appreciate it, as always, Anirban. And I'll email Lawrence and thank him as well. That was all the questions that we had for you, but enlightening as ever. And we certainly do appreciate you. You're a true natural resource for Marylanders and realtors especially. So thank you very much.
The engagement with Maryland realtors, which has happened for decades now for me.
It has, yeah. Thank you very much.
You will.
And so somebody who's in control of this will sign us off, and we'll see you all next time. Again, keep your eye out for the additional webinars coming up, especially the one that's going to be pretty popular on unemployment insurance with the Department of Labor next week. So keep your eyes open for that. And registration is open now, actually, but we'll be marketing that more next week and the rest of this week. So whoever can sign us off can sign us off. And thanks all, and be safe, especially. We'll see you all soon.